That's going to happen. Yeah, that's going to be part of the price you pay. The question is, are you willing to experience those things if that's what it takes? Now, willing doesn't mean wanting. You don't want to hear all those critical voices in your head. You don't want to feel anxious and sad and angry. I'm not asking you to want it, but are you willing to experience it if that's what it takes? Because that's what it's going to take. Okay? Now, you can see how this stuff applies to a population where they've developed problems like, say, agoraphobia. If you want to be part of the world again because you want contact with others and to live independently, then you're going to have to find a way of getting back to the supermarket. And there is, you know, and anybody who's worked with people with these kind of problems, you may have done at a stage in your career, will know, there is no way of making people feel okay and calm and relaxed and then go out and do stuff. You only get better at doing it by going out and doing it and feeling wretched, but being able to cope with feeling wretched. So whenever we do stuff, there will be a price to pay to our thoughts and our feelings. And the question is not, well, do I do it because it's morally right, it's good for the soul? No. Is this what it costs to do this thing which will improve how far I live my life by my values? Okay? So am I willing to experience that, if that's what it takes? Because willing doesn't mean wanting. And if we're working with people, I'm not going to go through this in huge depth, you think, well, that's a lot to ask. Yeah, sure. And you equip people with skills to help them cope with the presence of those feelings, not get rid of them, because as soon as you start trying to get rid of them, they'll escalate again. So you try and cope with stuff, and there's various stuff we do, including mindfulness exercises, behavioural stuff. And I'm going to point you at the end, if you're interested in this stuff, where to look for more information. A lot of it boils down to this. Look, I'm going to do this action in the service of this value that matters to me. And I'm willing to experience these unwanted thoughts, feelings, or possibly physical sensations, if that's what it takes. Okay? It can be physical symptoms, of course, people with pain problems. They have to tolerate the presence of some more pain in order to go to that family wedding. But be willing to do it because it's being part of your family. Okay. So, the next obvious question is, I've done that kind of for you, because I think it is a universal model. Now let's look back at why that's relevant for end-of-life care. You could fill this in for yourself, I'm sure, because you know the population, and if you've understood anything I've said, you'll map it across straight away, I'm sure. But here's some of the things that strike me, and why I got into doing it this way. You tend to see a progressive loss of valued activity as illness progresses. Why? Because the illness is real. And it is genuinely limiting. So the way you've done stuff in the past becomes progressively less available to you. And therefore, it is very easy to end up missing out on experiencing living by those values, because the way you've done it before, you know, you can't do it by working every hour God sends, because you're physically not up to it anymore. You can't do it by playing football with your kids in the park, because you can't get out of bed anymore. So you get that progressive loss of valued activities. What does that lead to? Lack of fulfillment. Then you get lots of troubling thoughts. And here's the bit, this is why, you know, those of you who know a bit more about cognitive behavioural therapies, in particular that dominant form we call cognitive therapy, where you recognise maladaptive thoughts and challenge them, what's often called cognitive restructuring. Here's one of the reasons why that doesn't always fit quite so beautifully with this population, is some of the worst thoughts are perfectly accurate. You know, I am going to die and my child will grow up without a mother, and it's true. Now, you know, and I feel really sad about that and scared on their behalf. Tell me the bit of that that's irrational, undeserved, malfunctional thinking. It's not. However, it doesn't mean that that thought has to be in charge of you. It doesn't mean that thought has to push you around. So, anyway, moving back. So you will get more troubling thoughts, many of them accurate, powerful emotions. We're all dealing with very strong emotion all the time. Mostly deserved. Yeah, occasionally you can see somebody whose emotion reaction is harder to make sense of until you get into the workings of the head. But sadness, fear, anger, shame, guilt, hard to argue with the presence of those in the context that we meet people. Whereas working with values, you know, okay, these are reasons why I like it in this territory. It sounds kind of a high-flown way of saying it, but hopefully you'll get it. It respects the presence of suffering. It's very, very disabling and insulting if people perceive that your approach to helping them psychologically isn't respectful of the reality of their suffering. And this way of working, really does. It helps you pick out what to aim for and get back some of that experience of valued life, albeit in small ways. You would have loved to have done it this way, you do it this way. You would have loved to be out there kicking a ball around in the park, and what you're doing is you're sitting in bed watching a DVD with them. It doesn't feel the same. But if the reason why kicking the ball in the park mattered most was being part of their experience and a memory for the future and a bit of bonding, then okay, this gives you some of that. Not the same, but it gives you some of it. So it helps you work out the ways of doing that and can give meaning and purpose to whatever time's left. Remember, loss of meaning, loss of purpose, tied with hopelessness. This is where often the psychological component of desire for death comes from, is what's the point anymore? And it helps people see what the point is and how in some tiny ways they can still be working towards the point. And then I think it does give hopes of realistically achievable goals, feeling less hopeless, less helpless. And again, for those of you who know the area, helplessness and hopelessness are a better prediction of desire for suicide than depression or low mood is. Those are the actually big predictors of it, helplessness. And what I also like about it can kind of help your emotional closeness and communication with family and friends. You can get people talking about stuff in a different way, within their own vocabularies and their own sort of social constructs. I have no idea what the next slide is. Oh, it's that. Okay, so knowing that we're about 5 minutes out, aren't we? So going back to Paul, how does this apply to Paul? Well, what I did with Paul, and I had a short time, because you had to hear his situation, hear his suffering, accept it, not run a mile from it. The actual amount of time for doing stuff was going to be short, and given how remote his family were going to be, me doing much more with him was not on the cards, although the Macmillan nurses would be out there, so I could work through that a little bit. But we actually just ended up having one conversation. And he'd been talking a lot about his death and had touched on his funeral, so those things were very much in the park. They were talkable with, and you could tell from the way he talked about it that addressing them wasn't the problem. So I did a sort of thought exercise with him that's used a lot in this school, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend always doing it with cancer palliative care patients, but for him it was right, actually. And what I ended up saying to him was this, that he knew that within a few months, he knew he was going to die. And he mentioned his funeral, so I talked about his funeral, and said, okay, so you know how it works, Paul. You know at the funeral somebody's going to stand up and say nice things about you. That's what happens at funerals. When somebody does that, what do you want them to be able to say about how you approached these last few months? What do you want them to be able to truthfully say about it? And he kind of had a thing, and started scratching his head. And he said, well, he was really involved with his niece and nephew. Kind of whatever he could do, he would do with them. And then it's just had to say, okay, so how are we going to make that happen then? And I know that's one tiny, tiny little bit of his whole experience, but actually it gave him something he could do. And he gave him purpose. And through checking back with the community staff that were with him, he was actually building ways that he could be involved in their life. So it didn't change anything tangibly in his life. He wasn't some massive new insight. But what it did was it enabled us to find something that he thought was worthwhile. And then we could work on the practicality of how he'd do it under his declining situation. And actually, it did seem to help. And the bit about it's not worth it anymore seemed to go away. And yeah, of course he died. And he was fortunately well symptom controlled. And this bit about the hopelessness didn't seem to rear its head again. So he was one of the first people I kind of summoned the courage to try that with. And if it had gone horribly badly wrong, I probably would have just given up on the whole thing and never been standing here talking about it, but it didn't. And as a theme, as a way of working with people, it does seem to me to be quite useful. Now, if you want to learn more about this, one of the best places to go for the website. This approach to psychology, its home lives on the web, basically, and it's a website called contextualscience.org, and there's lots of stuff there. Fascinating. That's that kind of home of the sort of parent organisation for it. That it's got a strange ethos, but one I really like. The idea is everybody should, if you come up with a new protocol, you put it on there. Completely against copyright law. If you get a paper published, you stick a PDF on there and things. It can only be downloaded by members of the organisation. But here's the funny thing about the organisation. It was the Association for Contextual Behavioural Science. American-based, and because it just costs quite a bit to run those things and websites, it was $50 a year to join originally. Then after a few years, they said, that's not a very we seem to share some values here. That's not a very values-driven way of doing it. So they changed it, and they said, right, the subscription is how much you think it's worth. So your annual subscription is how much you think it's worth to you. The heartening thing is, in the first year, the subscriptions went up from $50 a head to the average was $56 a head. But the practical implication of that is, if, like me, you're doing this quite a lot, and it's become part of how you make a living, then you end up paying more than that. That's fine, I've no problem with that. If you're just interested in dipping your toe in the water, you want access to not just all the websites free, except for downloadable resources. I think for sort of credit card handling purposes, there's a minimum of $5 you have to pay. Just pay that. And if after a year you're interested in it, then you do what you think's right. So I'm not suggesting you do that, but it's just a fascinating way of developing a resource. So that's the website. And if you like books, that's the book to read. If you want the sort of doing it as a therapist, as a care worker, this isn't just a thing for psychological therapists. You would need some kind of training, but given the kind of professions that are here, it would be suitable for anybody. It's not something you'd say, person in the street pick it up, has no idea of kind of boundaries, what's okay ethically and what's not. You'd have to have a professional background that's already taught you that stuff. But that would be the book to go for. Or he does self-help books as well. The same guy's a very clear communicator, Russ Harris. So the main self-help book is a book called The Happiness Trap. I often find a good self-help book gets you into a way of thinking faster than an academic book. So that's a really fascinating book, and it's at the price of a standard paperback, so it's not that expensive. But The Happiness Trap, as the title suggests, yeah, okay, it's kind of aimed at people who are prone to low mood, but actually the principles are the same as for everything else they're talking about. So they'll talk about values and stuff. So that's for the general population. You do kind of think sometimes, though, I find myself thinking, well, look, if only there's more of a self-help level of book that looks how you apply those principles kind of to end-of-life problems. But not just that, to other major life crises, because it's the same thing, isn't it? So the same challenges come with divorce, with other losses, as come with facing end-of-life issues. So, it'd be nice if there's a self-help book that looked at those and kind of a chronic illness as well. That's it. Thank you. I'll just leave that slide up there then, shall I? Okay, thank you very much.